Good morning. Welcome once again to the newspaper review. We've taken a look at stories making the rounds on front page of the Punch newspaper. But currently, we're being joined by our guest, who is a public affairs analyst. It's a friend of the house, and that's Mr. Olojede. Could you please, Mr. Olojede, could you please give me your full name? It just briefly skipped my mind. Bolahan Olojede. Yes, good morning and welcome to the newspaper review.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, Mr. Bolahan Olojede, let's talk about the rule of law, and we can make references to recent happenings in the country. But the rule of law has been briefly defined by a case where the law rules, even though it was made by men, and even though that men are being put in place of authority to execute and to interpret these laws. So let's talk about the rule of law. What comes to mind when you hear that word?
Well, when the rule of law is mentioned, what comes to mind, or what should come to mind, is an environment in the law exists, the people recognize it, and the society is willing to implement it as it is.
Okay. So
the law must be there, and the society must implement its own law, if by as it is. And if it needs to change it, the society must know that it is law and not man for law. So if there's any need to change it, the society should definitely go ahead and change it. But while the law subsists, it should be obeyed to the letter. If you don't want me to relate some of the things that are going on in our environment, then I can do on that.
Okay, but before we do that, Mr. Bolahan, let's look at, there's been this argument that men, most especially in Nigeria, that institutions are weak, and the men who are in charge of the institutions, or most especially to execute the laws of those institutions, seem to be bigger or more powerful than those institutions. And the antagonists, or those who have a different perspective of the rule of law, have said that these laws are made by men, and the judiciary is in place to interpret those laws, and the judiciary are men. The chief executive, most especially in the states and at the central level, they are occupied by men. The positions are occupied by men, and they've been charged with the responsibility to execute those laws. The police officers are men and women of the force who have the right within the confines of the law to execute the law. That the tendency for the rule of law not to be abused is very, very slim. What's your opinion?
The institutions are weak, and that is at the heart of the problem. We have the legislation who have been charged with making the law. Then the judiciary interprets the law, and the executive executes the laws. Now, when you have the people, you mentioned the police, for example.
Yeah.
The police as an institution is weak. It is in a whole lot of dimensions. From the recruitment to the Nigerian police, who do we recruit? People to be paid to be recruited into the police. So there's graphs right from the beginning. So when somebody has paid to even be recruited in the first instance, the first message you have put in that person's mind is that you're great here, just set you. Then the person passes through that institution, the academy where he is trained, and there's nothing to write up about in the academy. People pass through, even when you are sick, and you have to pass through the humanizing state of some of those training schools, you will end up almost insane by the time you pass out.
Okay.
Now you go into the issues of welfare and remuneration that is not there. When you come to the judiciary, you see similar things. You see poor remuneration, you see a situation in which there is no financial autonomy. The guys
Bola, sorry to interrupt you. Now, these challenges that you have mentioned within institutions, if the rule of law is, if it prevails, doesn't the law make room for these challenges to be addressed within these institutions?
Well, it is the commitment to addressing them that is the issue. Of course, we're supposed to, for example, I remember a former president visited the police academy in Ikeja after a documentary by a media house. He visited, and after his visit, he said he didn't know that that was the state of the thing. And immediately after his visit, there was a revamp. Well, I can assure you that that same institution that was revamped then has gone back again. So the structure that supports us being able to correct the anomalies that we have seen in the system is literally non-existent.
Okay. Still, let's look at it from this perspective. Recently, I'm sure you are very much aware that Section 84, subsection 12 of the Electoral Act has been in contention for quite a while now, and I dare say it's still in contention. A lot of commissioners or a lot of ministers from the central government and the state government, some of them didn't want to step down, probably because it was still in the court of law. But at the moment, after the court sat concerning it and the president came out to make a speech directing it to some of his ministers, some of them had to resign, although some of them are still challenging it at the moment now. In that case, this is something that has to do with law. If the president hadn't come out to make a statement, would some of the ministers who resign, would they have tendered a resignation letter? A lot of people see this as placing the president excuse me, above the law, which might not be that case. But given the scenario, what would you say?
I think if the president had not asked them to resign, most of the people might not have resigned. And the reason is because the matter was unresolved in the courts. Even as we speak today, it is unresolved to the final stage, because the president and the attorney general have now approached the Supreme Court to interpret what is going on. So as we're speaking, it is still in the court system.
Okay. Now, there is a tendency that we will be having post-primary election, barrage of post-primary election litigations in the courts of law, and if people emerge through this procedure and maybe the judgment or the verdict comes out later, will it annul a prospective that has been elected into office?
Definitely. It can annul it. It can annul it. We've seen this in the past, in which elected officials lost their positions by virtue of certain litigation that were not determined in time.
Okay. So
if we cannot determine this matter in time, and by the time the court finally determines, if he ruled against an elected official, that elected official will lose his position.
Okay, let's move away from this. We are not completely leaving the discourse of the rule of law, but let's make reference to recent happenings. We're talking about Deborah Samuel's case, who was brutally murdered. This is not the first time a case like this, things like this about blasphemy and jungle justice is happening, most especially in the northern part of the country. There was a time we had same scenario in Rivers State, but most especially, predominantly, is coming from the northern part of the country. The rule of law. When things like this happen and it was not handled within the confines or within the length of the rule of law, it gives room for reoccurrence. Now we're talking about nationwide protests by Christian Association of Nigeria, but we have different state governments coming out to say the protest must not hold. Now, does this fall within the confines of the rule of law?
It does, but it also has some other dimensions which we have to be very careful about. If we go back to the START incident in itself,
okay,
what happened was very sad because, number one, it was un-Islamic. So it cannot be said that it was Islam that made people take the laws into their hands. What Islam expected in the case of Deborah was that the Deborah should be brought before the law. There is the Sharia law. You should be brought before the law and let the authorities determine what should be the punishment. Somewhere in Islam or even in the culture that allows the people to deal with Deborah the way he has been dealt with. So there is a law problem there.
Okay.
The second part now is the issue of protest. Of course, if people want to protest, the law guarantees that
Mr.
you can have a peaceful protest.
Mr. Golao. Yes, before we go into the protest part, you mentioned something about Sharia law and how Deborah Samuel should have been brought before that particular platform of a legal system. But, you know, making a comparison about this issue, it has come up before that the superiority, which part of the law, those who are Muslims may be subjected to that, but those who are not Muslims, can they be subjected to that part of the law? And if we're to look at it differently, will the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and the saying that Nigeria being a secular state, would that be brought under for a religious law to take precedent?
Okay, let's start from what I will call the sources of Nigerian law.
Okay.
The Sharia law is part of the sources of Nigerian law, and Nigerians must be aware of it. Now, the second part is how does the Sharia law itself work? The Sharia law, non-Muslims are not compelled to be brought to judgment under the Sharia law.
Okay.
That is the reality. So a lot of things went wrong about the matter of Deborah. So if Deborah had been arrested and brought before the law will have said, "Oh, Deborah, you cannot be brought under the Sharia law unless Deborah accepts to be judged under the Sharia law."
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, okay. Now let's talk about the nationwide protest that Khan has called for and how different chief executives of the federating unit has been responding to that. You wanted to make comments on that?
Yeah, we have to be very careful about protest. The country, the laws of the land guarantee freedom to a peaceful protest. But when the emotions are still very raw, when we have a situation in which you saw the kind of riot, I will call it, that happened in Sokoto on that day.
Yes.
The question we must be asking is that if a protest is to happen in Sokoto today, can the police guarantee that it will indeed be peaceful? Does the police have enough men that will match the number of possible violent people that might get on the streets of Sokoto today if a protest like that is to happen? How will the protest be managed to avoid evolving into violence along the way? These are some of the non-legal issues that we must be careful of. You might have a protest like that in the southwest and it might not be well. But if you have it in some of those areas that are already burning, will the police be able to manage it? And that is the main issue I have, which I think we must be very careful about it.
Okay, now, can the Christian Association of Nigeria equally, thought along this line you just painted? And so therefore, in the report, they said the protest is not going to be streets. They were not going to march on the streets. They were going to be in front of the secretariat in different states to register their opinion and to register their grievances to the authorities concerned about the brutal way and the jungle justice that was carried out on Deborah. Now, would that drive home the point? Because there seem to be chief executives evoking laws in different states that it must not Those such protests must not hold. And they're referring to those who wanted to protest as troublemakers. Would that be the right way to, to curb this, or to, elicit an understanding?
We must be careful about stifling people's rights to protest. The main problem I see about this protest is what we have just discussed about the possibility that it might end up in violence if they enter the street. But if they are just going to do this in their secretariat, I think the police should be able to provide the necessary coverage for the protesters who are doing this just at the secretariat of camp.
Okay.
This is the barest minimum respect that the Nigerian police should be able to do for these people, to guarantee that their rights will not be trampled upon. They should have the right to peaceful protest, especially when they are doing it within the confines of their own space.
Okay. Now, let's look at this last question before we go. How can the government, both at the federal level and at the state level, and most especially in the northern part of Nigeria, prevent a recurrence of this issue that Deborah or people being, jungle justice being meted out to people on alleged blasphemy with regards to religious perspective? How can they prevent a recurrence of it?
Well, education.
No, education. This thing happened in a tertiary institution, and a tertiary institution, this is a college of education, which means that this particular tertiary institution is responsible for churning out students who will become teachers and hopefully lecturers in the society. So if we are re-echoing the mantra, education, 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 don't you think it has been defeated already?
No, because we're looking at education only from the perspective of those things that are studied in the four walls of those institutions. Well, education goes way beyond that. In fact, the biggest education that is influencing what is going on there happens outside of those institutions. They happen by virtue of the preachings that are going on in several parts of that particular state. The words from the clerics, the words from the preachers, and the people of a country like Nigeria, a very religious country, they listen more to what their pastors say, what their imam says, more than what the lecturer is saying in the class. Don't forget that in the case of the Quran was at some time said to be, hidden by the security operative of that institution. So an attempt to protect her. But that's the people came there and took him. Even when you go back all the way to 1994, when Gideon Akaluka was already in the police station, hidden by the police, they came into that police station, picked him up and killed him. So what is turning the minds of the people in the wrong direction is not what they are hearing in those schools. It is what is being preached when the schools are not there. And that is why I say education. And it is not just about the Muslims as well. Even Christians, the sensitivity to the environment in which you have found yourself is important. Is very, very important in the pluralistic environment.
Okay.
So all those lectures about tolerance, nobody goes to the class in the College of Education and they are teaching them about tolerance.
Okay.
They're not teaching them.
Okay. Bola Olojede, our time is fast spent. I would have loved to continue the discourse with you, but we will have to go. But thanks a lot for your time this morning.
Thanks for listening.
You're very much welcome.